Hi, I'm Igor Smirnov, and I'd like to welcome you into this lesson called Blitz Champion. As you're probably aware, in a few days, on the 23rd of November, we're organizing a Blitz tournament. Of course, you're welcome to participate, and in light of that, I've decided to share some tips with you that will help you improve your Blitz play and get better results in the upcoming tournament. If you play Blitz online, you may have noticed that there are some players with an official rating of 2300s, 2400s, while their Blitz power is a lot greater. They are rated above 3000s and they beat a lot of Grandmasters easily. This proves that Blitz play requires some specific skills from you. And if you know these specific techniques, you can improve your results in Blitz games a lot. That's exactly what we're going to talk about in this lesson. I've already shared some rules about this topic in my previous lessons. Today you'll be learning some new ideas as well as repeating the most crucial ideas about a Blitz play that you might learned in my previous lessons already. Now let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, you need to attack. This is probably the most important advice. In long-time control games, one may use different style. For instance, Carlsen can play a long maneuvering game and at the very end get a whole point out of nothing. Well, of course he's a good player. Anyway, in Blitz games that's not gonna work. Here you need to attack and you must play aggressively. Let's have a look at this very typical position. How would you play here as white? In a standard long-time control game, the most natural and probably the best move would be to castle. However, in Blitz, I recommend that you play more aggressively. So let's see what white can do. In this particular game, white played g4. Now we can see the point of the white's idea. What will be the next moves of white? Obviously he'll play g5. After h takes, white will recapture, probably with the bishop. After that he'll install his rook on the g file, opposing it against black's king, and then white will maybe castle queenside, and all of his moves are very natural and he can play any of them instantly, almost unthinkingly. Now let's think about the same position from black's side. What should black do now? As you can see, this is very unclear. There are two typical scenarios for black. The one way is that black may start thinking hard and maybe he'll find a good defense in the end and he'll get a good position, maybe even he'll get an advantage, but while he'll be thinking, he will spend a lot of time, and in the end of the game he'll appear in a time trouble and will make a blunder and will lose in time pressure. That's one way. An alternative way for black is to continue playing quickly, but in this case there is a great chance that he'll get crushed with the white's attack. As you can see, in either way it's tough for black. That's why in such positions, in Blitz play, you'd better be on the white side, on attacker side. Let's make one move back. For example, even if you dislike the move g4, or if it's impossible in a certain particular moment, you can play a bishop d2 and then long castling with similar ideas to attack black in the future. You can push with g-pawn, you'll have the rook on the d-file opposed to black's queen, and you'll have some ideas on how to attack. You see, in either ways we're trying to play aggressively and creating threats against your opponent. Okay, let's go back to the actual game. There's g4, black played knight d5, white played rook g1, perhaps g5 was possible as well. Bishop b4 check, white played king f1, Well, the black's point is that if white plays c3, which is the most natural move, black can take, and then after b takes and bishop takes c3, that's a double attack on the white's king and rook. Actually, even in this position, I'm not so sure about black prospects in this game, because let's just continue the line. King f1, bishop a1, g5, and I believe that in Blitz game, this is a very difficult situation for black. Though once again, you see there is a huge difference. In a long-time control game, black may take his time, think about the position carefully, and maybe he'll find a defense and will win the game because of his material advantage. But in Blitz game, well, I believe that's very close to winning actually, because that's very difficult. White is attacking with all his forces and black must be very precise here. We're getting back to the actual game. White played king f1, then followed bishop e7, g5, pawn takes, knight takes. Of course, white could take with the bishop as well. Perhaps he want to give more space to his queen. Potentially it can go forward. Black played bishop d6. By the way, this is a long-time control game, and both of the players are very strong. This is a game between Andreikin and Sugirov. Both of them are strong grandmasters, and you see that black player is confused. His last maneuvers, bishop b4, then getting back to e7 to d6, are very strange. So even in a long-time control game, black were unable to find a reasonable defense. This means that in a Blitz game, white's attack would be successful for sure. Anyway, let's see what happened next. Knight to h7, and that's over. Now if black takes, white has the forcing way for a win. Bishop takes, then queen to h5, king g8, rook g7. Maybe white even has a few ways for a win, and that's just one of them. Bishop h6 check, and then if king goes to g8, white will play queen g4, queen g7 mate. And if king goes to h7 or to h8, white can capture the rook, or he can go bishop g5 check, but bishop f8 is more straightforward. Then queen takes f7 and it's over. On the next move he'll go knight g6 or queen g7. Now let's get back to the initial position of this example and make some general conclusions. Here it is. In this position, white had a choice between a few logical moves. White can castle, play bishop d2, bishop f4, maybe something else, c4, but he have chosen the most aggressive move, g4. And that's a proper way of playing Blitz games. You need to attack, create problems for your opponent, and choose the most aggressive continuations, even if they look not very solid and risky for you. In fact, the risk for your opponent is a lot greater. Here's the next advice. Play special openings. Most of the players have their opening repertoire and they use it both in classical games and in Blitz games. However, it's incorrect. If you look at the most successful Blitz players, you will see that they have their special tricky openings that they use in Blitz games solely. And this gives them great results, so don't underestimate this idea. You may be wondering what's wrong with your usual openings and why you shouldn't use them. Well, of course you may, but in this case you will let your opponent to play first 10-20 moves based on his opening preparation without spending any time on these moves, and moreover, even in the middle game stage your opponent will use the plans that he already know, typical plans for his opening. Of course you don't want to simplify your opponent's task so much, and it would be a lot greater idea if you can force your opponent to take time starting from the very first moves and to think about the positions by yourself. That's why it's very good if you can surprise your opponent in the opening. With that in mind, in the Blitz games I've played b3 opening with the white and I got pretty good results. I even recorded a video lesson with analysis about this opening, b3 for white. You can find the link to those lessons below the video. You may try to use it as well. I'm sure it will bring you good results. Alexander Morozevich, who is a strong blitz player with black, against d4, used Chigorin defense with knight to c6. In another tournament, blitz tournament, he used Albin's counter gambit e5, and those openings gave him really good results. So you may try to do the same. With white, there are a lot of things you may try. For example, against Sicilian defense, once I played this position and I came up with the move b4 here. I won that game, and after that I've analyzed this variation for some time, and all of a sudden I realized that it's quite dangerous for black, and it's a lot better than it may look at first sight, because then after, let's say, c takes, you push d4, you're threatening d5, and it's not so clear what should black do now. Again, you can find the link with analysis of this variation below the video. I'm sure if you watch that lesson and use this opening in your games, it will bring you a couple of nice victories. Okay, let me show you some more examples. Against e5, there are many things you can use. For example, you can play the central opening d4. It was popular maybe 200 years ago, but now it's almost unused completely. Nevertheless, it's not so easy to handle. After that, white is going to castle queenside. It may go in this way. Of course, I'm not demonstrating you the opening theory right now. It's not the purpose of this lesson. I'm just showing you the ideas briefly, and later you can play bishop h6 or push the h-pawn, and in either case you will create some problems for black, and he will have to be very careful, and he will need to think about these variations and spend his time, which is very bad for him in blitz games. Okay, now let me make a few general notes about your opening choice in the opening. First of all, as we have already discussed, you should try to surprise your opponent in the opening and force him to think. That's why your opening line should be not very common. Secondly, your opening should be aggressive. We know that in blitz it's very important to play actively, and your opening choice should facilitate this style of playing. Gambits may be very suitable. And lastly, of course, you need to spend little time to familiarize yourself with these variations before you are going to play them. In that case, you will really have the advantage against your opponent, because you will play the moves quickly based on your preparation, while your opponent will have to spend time and think about it during the real game. In the end, let me make one little note about what openings are wrong, which openings you should not use in blitz. I've seen that some players start playing something obscure, something like this, and then, let's say, moving knight to c7 in blitz games. They try to get their opponent out of his opening preparation. Although generally this is a good idea, this is a ridiculous opening, and most importantly, it does not create any problems for white. And that's why it is bad. You should not play like that. True, you want to break your opponent's opening preparation, but still you need to play normal moves. Otherwise you will create problems for yourself, not for your opponent. Another opening choice I've seen that some players use with black is the opening when they place their pieces on the 7th rank, something like this, and after that they play knight e7 and knight d7. It's not that bad for black. It has one big advantage, because you can play the first moves unthinkingly. No matter what white does, you can play those moves. But the big disadvantage of this opening is that it is quite passive. Black is putting his pieces on the last ranks and is not creating any problems for white at the early stage of the game, and that's why it's not the best choice. Once again, we want to play aggressively. In total, if you follow these recommendations, if you play not very well known openings, which are aggressive in nature, perhaps gambits, and if you take some time to prepare these openings before the tournament, it will bring you great results for sure. The next advice relates to on-blind blitz solely. Obviously you cannot use it in real over-the-board games. I bet you know what is pre-move, but right now I'm gonna tell you how to make the most benefit out of this function. Just in case, let me show you what a pre-move is. It means that while your opponent is thinking about his move, you may show which move you're going to play next. And after opponent plays his move, computer will play your move instantly, spending almost no time at all. And this is called pre-move. It makes a huge difference in Blitz games. In a real all-to-the-board game, if you have 5 seconds on the clock, it means that you're lost. Maybe you'll be able to play 5 moves, but that's not enough, and that's desperate. In the online Blitz, if you have 5 seconds, that's a lot of time, because thanks to pre-move you can make 20 moves, maybe 30, and that's a lot. So you can realize your advantage for sure. If you have an extra queen or something like that, you will win the game, even though you have just a few seconds on the clock. That's why we should not be deceived by a little quantity of time left on the opponent's clock. Thanks to these modern functions like pre-move, he'll be able to realize his advantage. And of course, especially in the games with an increment, when each player gets a bonus, like 1-2 extra seconds for every move you play, in that case, of course, you need to be very careful, because if you have a bad position, you cannot hope that your opponent will lose on time. And that's not gonna happen, and that's why you need to play very solidly and very carefully. Okay, let's come back to pre-move. So, how to use it properly? A lot of players know about this option and try to use it, but sometimes it works against them. For example, I played a lot of games like this when my opponent here played knight of 3. Of course, it was because they installed this move as a pre-move before I played d5, like against c5 or e5 or e6, knight of 3 will work well for white, but against knight of 6 or d5, that's not gonna work, and here it will just lose the e4 pawn for nothing, which is bad for white. That's not a good example. Also, I've seen that some tricky guys try to make use of your potential mistake. For white, they play here bishop g5, hoping that maybe you will play e6, and in that case, of course, they'll just grab your queen and will be glad that they are so tricky and got a win just from nothing. Now let's be more serious and think when you really can and should use this pre-move function. The first situation when you may and should use pre-move is when your opponent has no attacking moves, no attacking possibilities. This may happen if your opponent has no pieces at all on the board. In that case, of course, he has no active possibilities, and sometimes this may happen if there are just a few pawns left on the board or just a few pieces. Something like this. In this position, let me ask you a bit tricky question. How should white play it here? Obviously, the correct move is g4, and this should be played in a normal game, but in Blitz, sometimes, surprisingly, it may be not the best option, because if you secure your position, you can then play moves without spending any second on that using the pre-move, but first you need to secure your position. That's why in a Blitz, in online Blitz game, the best move for white might be to play b3, because after that you don't have to care about black's move b5 anymore, and even if you overlook it, even if black plays it and you don't react on that, nothing will happen because your pawns are already protected. This means that after that you'll be able to play the moves using pre-move function, so you'll play g4 and you'll set the pre-move king g3. So after your opponent plays king g5, computer will play king g3 instantly without spending any second on that. And by using this method, you'll be able to win this game even if you have just, a few seconds left on the clock. you'll still have enough time to realize the advantage. And once again, even if your opponent will decide to surprise you and take advantage of your pre-moves and will all of a sudden play b5, well, computer will replay your pre-move king f3, nothing bad will happen with you because everything is already protected on the king side. Of course, such an advice may be a bit weird, I understand that, but you know, in Blitz games we have to use all the possibilities that are available for you. How would you play here as white? White has a little combination, bishop takes h6, and then after pawn takes, queen to g6 check, using a pin on black's pawn. In such cases, it's also a very suitable moment to use a pre-move, because here you can be sure that your opponent is going to play king h8. That's why at this point you can set queen h6 as a pre-move, and after your opponent plays king h8, computer will automatically replay your move queen takes h6. Another suggestion for this position is that you should make a repetition. If you can, you should repeat the position at least once or maybe twice, because thanks to pre-move you can play these moves without spending any second on that. Well, your opponent will spend maybe 1 or 2 seconds on playing the moves king g8 and king h8, and although it may seem unimportant right now, at the end of the game these 1-2 seconds may become decisive. And after you make the repetition, on the next move you'll start thinking about which move you're going to play now, and then you'll play it. Here it's probably knight to d5, and then knight f6 and white's winning. So that was another situation when you may use a pre-move. It's after you make a check, and in positions when you can repeat the position. These are other two situations when you can and should use a pre-move. Okay, now let me show you one last trick about that. In a classical game, in such a situation white should just resign, but in a Blitz game you can be tricky. Well, of course I hope that you will not appear in such a situation with white pieces. I hope that you will play well and will get advantage, but you know, sometimes an accident may happen and you may appear in a losing position, and still you need to fight until the end. In such positions, very often black player tries to make mate using a linear mate, playing queen c4, queen d3, queen c2, and ultimately queen d1. Now let's just see how it may look like. Queen c4, queen d3, queen c2, and on the next move queen d1. That's the way how a lot of players try to win such positions. Since you're aware of that, you can try to make use of this situation. Let's go back to the starting position. The trick is that you should try to keep your king closer to opponent's queens. Let's see how it may work for you. So you go king e3 as close as it's possible to black's queens. Black answers queen c4. You play king f2. He goes queen d3. Now you play king e1, and after queen c2, that's a stalemate. And using this trick you can save half of the point, and although this may look funny, I've seen a lot of Blitz games which ended like this. The next advice may seem obvious, although a lot of players ignore it. The advice is that you need to look at the clock sometimes and keep control over your time. Most often players start caring about the time when they have very little time on the clock. When you have just 10 or 20 seconds left, it is obvious that now you must play quickly, and everybody starts doing that. At the same time, I recommend that you be more prudent, even in the opening and in the middle stage. After you play the move, you have some free time while your opponent is thinking, and during this free time, you may have a look at the clock and see what is your time and what's your opponent time. If you follow this way, you will always keep control over the time and will never appear in a time trouble suddenly for yourself. Now let's quickly review all the main advices we have discussed in this lesson. First of all, in Blitz games you need to attack. That's probably the most important thing you need to keep in mind while playing. You should be aggressive, you should create threats for your opponent and play in attacking style. Next, you need to prepare a special opening repertoire for Blitz. Well, at least you can prepare a few special openings. This will make your opponent thinking starting from the very first seconds and will give you advantage right from the beginning of the game. Also, you need to use your time rationally. Use pre-move function when possible. Also, keep an eye on your time and make sure that you are not behind your opponent. If you find yourself in such a situation, you need to speed up and play quicker, even if it is an opening or a middle game right now. If you see that you're behind in time, you should start playing quicker. Don't wait until the situation when you appear in a serious time trouble. If you follow all these advices, you have great chances to improve your Blitz play, and who knows, maybe you will become a Blitz champion in the tournament that is going to happen on the 23rd of November. And if you have not subscribed to this tournament yet, you may do this by following the link below the video. Thanks for watching this lesson, I hope it was helpful. I wish you nice games and great victories. Talk to you in the next lessons. Goodbye.